Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Ramazan Kılıç. I'm a professor of political science and the director of Islamic Studies program at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Today, we have two wonderful speakers to talk on Afghan women's activism and international intervention. I think this is very meaningful in Women's History Month. So I'm particularly glad that this just came out at the right time. Dr. Jennifer Fleury is professor and chair of the Department of Geography at the University of Colorado Boulder. She's a feminist political geographer whose research examines conflict, gender, geopolitics, international aid, and economic development in Afghanistan. She has published over 30 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters and several co-authored books. She recently gave a TED Talk on women's rights, guess where? In Afghanistan. So Wazhma Frogh is the director of Women's and Peace Studies organization, which she co-founded in 2012. She was a senior advisor on women in security and human rights for the Afghan Ministry of Defense and a deputy chief of staff to the Afghan Ministry of Interior. In 2009, she received the US State Department's Women of Courage Award. Recently, she spoke at the United Nations Security Council on international community's reactions about the recent events in Afghanistan. So as the biographies show, we are really lucky to have these two wonderful speakers for today's event. Today's event is the 13th in our series, Dialogue with Muslim Communities in Omaha. These civic conversations have only been possible thanks to the support of Humanities Nebraska. We sincerely appreciate Humanities Nebraska's collaboration and support of this talk and programming. I also would like to thank our co-sponsors, UNO Religious Studies Department, UNO Political Science Department, UNO History Department, and Goldstein Center for Human Rights, and also UNO International Studies. I also would like to thank Women in Public Policy Initiative for including this event in their series this year. Before taking too much of your time, let me give you a piece of information about the Zoom webinar. If you have questions for any of the speakers, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom. If you have general or technical questions, you can use the chat feature to reach to us. In this particular event, we partner with Center for Afghanistan Studies. It's a center which has been around for about 5 decades at UNO. My friend and colleague, Sherjan Ahmadzai, who is the director of the center, will moderate the Q&A section after the talk and remarks. So now I would like to ask Sherjan Ahmadzai to offer a welcome on behalf of the center and give a brief background on our topic today. It's your turn, Sherjan.
Ramazan, thank you very much. I am honored to moderate today's session with wonderful speakers that I know personally of their work and themselves. I know Dr. Jennifer Fleury from her work. Wonderful work she has done on Afghanistan and the women, and I know Wazhma Frogh from many years. We were part of that time, and I was younger group of Afghan youth in 2002, 2003, and through other circles working in Afghanistan when I was in Kabul, Afghanistan before 2007. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to moderate this wonderful, timely discussion on women in Afghanistan, their plight after the regime collapse, the republic's collapse in Afghanistan. But before going into the discussion, I'd like to present a brief information about the center. Well, our center, the Center for Afghanistan Studies, was established at the University of Nebraska at Omaha in 1972, 50 years ago, which is much older than I am. And we have been a national hub for research and academic work on Afghanistan. Continuing with our mission and partnering with Islamic Studies program under Dr. Ramazan's leadership, we are here to provide opportunities to our students, community members, and broader audience from around the world. With opportunities like this, as we moderate the discussion, it's an important topic concerning the plight of women in Afghanistan. As we all know, last year, August 15th, the regime of the Islamic Republic collapsed at the hands of Taliban, and the United States withdrew all its forces the end of that month. Afghanistan faced economic meltdown, political meltdown, social meltdown, unprecedented humanitarian and political crises. In all of this, in the midst of all of this, the group that faced the harshest of all these crises were women and girls, making 50% of the population. They bore the brunt of all those things. And the current limbo has exacerbated that situation that we have seen. There are many questions about the women's rights in Afghanistan. What have been happening? What would happen with the achievements that women had in Afghanistan in the last 20 years? To some extent, there were successful stories, there were unsuccessful stories. How could they keep those achievements? And what would happen to the women's rights, the children's rights, economic uncertainties they're facing as mothers, as sisters, as workers of the government, and a potential complete collapse of public service institutions and social service institutions in overall? How would that be? I'm honored to moderate the discussion with a wonderful author, Dr. Jennifer Fleury, and a wonderful person that I've personally known, Dr. Wazhma Frogh, on this discussion. Today, as Ramazan, you said, first, I will ask Dr. Fleury to present your remarks, and then we'll follow on with Wazhma Frogh, and then after that, we'll have a Q&A with the audience. So, Dr. Fleury, floor is yours. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for asking me to speak today. I really appreciate it. And so I'm just going to share my screen. I just have a few slides to get us started. So, as it says in the title, my talk will mainly be kind of reflections on Afghan women's activism and international intervention. And mainly I'll be focusing on the last 20 years. But before I get to that, I just want to give a brief history of women's rights and activism in pre-war Afghanistan, because I think oftentimes we forget that women were very active and there was a women's movement in Afghanistan prior to the onset of war. And so various leaders, female leaders in Afghanistan, from Queen Soraya, who was a part of the monarchy in the 1920s, advocated for girls' education and women's rights in Afghanistan. And then in the 1964 constitution, under the monarchy of King Zahir Shah, men and women were identified as having equal rights under the law. Women's activism was very high in Afghanistan in the 60s and 70s, and various women's organizations were founded, and women were advocating for their rights. And at that time, as what I'll discuss a little bit later in this talk, women's ideas, women's movements, women's activism was never a singular category, never a singular group. So women advocated for rights there were women more on the leftist side. There were women there were more democratic leaning, women advocating for rights within Islam. And so there's always been a very robust and complicated and sometimes contradictory ideas among different women about how best to go about their rights. So both ideologically and methodologically. And I emphasize that because part of the critiques I've had about international intervention in Afghanistan is the push to sort of reduce Afghan women into one single category, or as if there's one experience or one kind of way of advocating or articulating women's rights. And I really think we need to push back against that and really challenge that, because I see the diversity of women's experiences and their diversity of approaches as the better way and best way to go, because as a geographer, I know just from my geographic training, what often works in one location will not work in another because of the social cultural context within which people live, and because of what is accepted or not accepted in a particular place. And so, I just wanted to kind of start off with that, and then I just want to spend a minute also talking about the public discourse that existed in the US and many other Western international spaces, particularly after 9/11. And I also want to, before I do that, as part of that history of Afghan women's activism and rights within the country, other invaders, not just the US, but the Soviet Union, when they invaded Afghanistan in 1979, they also were interested in quote unquote saving Afghan women and used very Orientalist and often racist ways of representing the Afghan people and their treatment of women. And so gender, women specifically, has been weaponized by the Soviet Union, by the US, and in some cases by also other resistance groups against invasion. everyone sort of vying for who is the one to quote unquote save Afghan women. And I would say the only consistent thing among them is not actually listening to Afghan women themselves and what they would like to see happen. And again, in those very complicated and complex ways of a diverse group of women. And so I want to take a moment just to remind us of, in 2001, those sort of public discourses around Afghan women that were very prevalent in the US. And the reason I bring this up now is because I've seen this sort of has resurfaced in the US withdrawal and the new sort of interest in Afghanistan that happened in August and in the fall. And this doesn't mean that women in Afghanistan haven't experienced significant difficulty. What my point here in critiquing this is that is the push to reduce women's lives, the complications of women's lives, to the veil or the burqa or the chaudhry, to this kind of narrow conception and conceptualization of women's lives. And so one of the ways in which this was done was, again, this kind of fetishization of the burqa or the chaudhry, which this is a C-SPAN image that was taken in October of 2001 of Carolyn Maloney, who was a US congresswoman from New York, who wore this on the House floor in an effort to advocate that US military efforts in Afghanistan after the October 7th, 2001 invasion would incorporate women's issues and women in Afghanistan. And then Laura Bush really took on the role of helping women in Afghanistan. And there's a very infamous speech that she gave on November 7th in 2001, where she called on people of the world to really unite in care of Afghan women and against the Taliban. However, she also used, I would argue, very racist language by making a distinction between civilized and uncivilized people, and very kind of colonist and Orientalist language that I think we should be critical of, even though I think her efforts were, her intention was probably very good, but words matter, and words coming from someone of her caliber really, I think, should have been a little bit more careful. And then in the popular sector, we had National Geographic, a very popular US magazine, trying to find the so-called Afghan girl image from the 1980s. And then this burqa free was a poster competition. Then there was Miss Afghanistan and the Miss Earth pageant, which she was actually born in Kabul, but raised in California. And then Little Kim, who was a rapper, using a very kind of orientalized and fetishized version of the burqa, like sexualizing it. And then Aisha's image on the cover of Time magazine in 2010 with this idea of what happens if we leave Afghanistan, meaning the US, even though the US was in Afghanistan when that happened. And then the other image here is the Beauty Without Borders. So what I saw happening in the US at that time in the early 2000s is really to try to dichotomize, like seeing the burqa and the veil as a negative and something backward, and then the sort of revealing and hyper exposure of the female body as somehow progressive, which I would argue, many feminist scholars actually critique that, and that women being able to choose what to wear, I think, is more important than fetishizing or representing a particular kind of dress as somehow inherently backward or not progressive or hurtful to women. And so that was the discourse that really, I think, was trying to shape kind of public opinion and rally public opinion to support what the US was doing in Afghanistan. And so my research really my dissertation research was really on Afghan women's activism. And then I was actually encouraged by a friend that I met in Pakistan to really look at the international interventions in Afghanistan. And as a US citizen, I really felt like it was important to look at what the US was doing. And I say US-led interventions because this was very much an international effort, although the US was the largest donor country and the largest military, and really was leading these efforts. Although I would also argue there wasn't a lot of coordination, which was another part of some of the problems of international aid and development interventions. And so I see the US interventions very much as a falling short. And so my research from 2006 on was focused on interviewing international aid and development workers, people who worked in the private military, private security, logistics and construction avenues, and then also interviewing Afghans who also worked in those sectors. And then most recently with my collaborator, Rachel Lair, who's also a linguist, we've been conducting research on women's roles in the peace building process, and then more recently on women's leadership in Afghanistan. So I'll touch on those a little bit as well. And so Rachel Lair and I wrote a book that came out in 2017 called The Carpetbaggers of Kabul and Other American Afghan Entanglements. And the reason we titled this Carpetbagger, and I just, because the term carpetbagger really originated during the American Civil War, when it was used to identify Northerners who went to the South to basically capitalize our profit from Civil War Reconstruction in the late 1800s. And we use this term specifically to refer to war profiteering in Afghanistan, or what like Naomi Klein would call disaster capitalism. So when we were in Kabul, Afghanistan, conducting research for our more recent projects, this was in 2014, we saw this image here, the Yankee Go Home image on the side of a building in Kabul, written in English, with graffiti ink, and we were sort of stopped to look at it, and we're both struck by the poignant representation of U.S. basically occupation, military occupation, aid and development occupation. Yankee Go Home is also a common slogan used by many throughout the globe to express resentment toward the American military presence in their countries. So we stopped to take photographs of the wall, and then later, as we were preparing to decide on what the cover of the book was, we decided we wanted to use that image, but the publisher said they needed a professional image because we were very much amateurs. And so we hired photographer Najabi to make an image for us. So Mr. Najabi made the image for us. And between the time that we photographed the image and he photographed the image, a year had passed. And this brand new wall, as you can see by the image we chose, was already crumbling. And I use this also as kind of a metaphor for what I'll be talking about today, which is this wall is not simply an identification of local sentiments against the US occupation, but also an allegory for the already crumbling reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan, and how so much of the problems of international intervention were the falling short and not really doing the important and needed work of helping to reconstruct the country that the US had a huge hand in helping to destroy. So the falling short, what I want to first talk about is that, a lot of media attention was paid to Afghanistan in August and September due to the Taliban resurgence and the chaotic and disorganized US evacuation of American citizens, but not all Afghan allies. In fact, many of my own colleagues are still stuck in Afghanistan, and despite our best efforts and initial working with the National Science Foundation and the Department of State, we were not able to help them to evacuate. And as someone who has been researching gender, economic development, conflicts and security in Afghanistan for 2 decades, I was struck by the way the Saving Woman narrative, which was established, as I mentioned, by the Bush administration in 2001, resurfaced. While women suffered physically, economically, emotionally, and politically under the Taliban, the prescription for improving women's lives in Afghanistan through economic development and humanitarian aid programs regularly imposed values incongruent with those held by many Afghan communities. The unrelentingly narrow representation of Afghan women as a single category simplified and curtailed a robust understanding of women's diverse experiences and articulation of their own needs and desires. While much of the public criticism of the US evacuation focuses on what women will lose now, and I think accurate, since the Taliban is back in power, precious little critique, at least in the US, has been placed on the failings and falling short associated with US-led interventions over the past 20 years. First, let me identify the successes. Many Afghan women, and I would argue by their own initiative and activism, have and in some ways benefited from internationally funded programs such as education, job skills training, and healthcare. Also, Afghan women's participation in politics since 2002 was partially due to quotas that included positions for women in both the upper and lower houses of parliament. Women also held political office as provincial governors and district and city mayors, along with being chosen by different presidents as ministers or holding cabinet positions. With the fall of the US-backed Afghanistan government, these positions, along with those held by many men, are gone or radically altered. Therefore, focusing on women and the changes to their lives during the Taliban regime remains an important discussion, but should include extensive criticism of the US-led international military, humanitarian aid, and economic development assistance. During the successive waves of women's participation in politics, education, and economic opportunities, along with improving women's health, the reach and sustainability of these programs and projects remains in question. This was evident from my own research on international aid and development interventions, which included surveys, as I mentioned, and extensive interviews, both with Afghans and international workers. And I really thank the people that were part of that study, because many of the international workers from the US and other countries were just as frustrated with the situation as someone coming as an outsider just doing research, because they went to Afghanistan, I think, with the expectation that they would be able to help, and felt really stymied by the politics. Additionally, the US government's own reports by the Office of the Special Investigator General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or known as SAGAR, John Sopko, identified similar findings and criticisms of US government agencies, such as the United States Agency for International Development and the US Department of State. The reach of programs targeting women's lives has been limited geographically and by existing social economic hierarchies. For example, women with English language competency and connections to the US and other international donor countries and organizations were undoubtedly more successful in garnering financial and political support from these organizations. However, the reach and effectiveness of them to then reach their Afghan colleagues and family and constituents in other parts of the country was really stymied by what I will focus on 5 factors that really stymied their ability to do the good work that they wanted to do. And I would also argue that the US, while being the largest donor country operating projects and programs in Afghanistan, we should remember over 50 countries, particularly at the height of international intervention, we're operating in Afghanistan as either in humanitarian aid, economic development, or as part of the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF. So the first one I want to focus on is subcontracting. So this was one of the major problems that our research revealed, is that many of the economic aid and development projects that were funded by USAID and other international organizations were subcontracted through what are known as implementing partners. And these partners, among those who are critical of this, including myself, basically became known as what we call the Beltway Bandits. And these are mostly for-profit companies geographically located along the Beltway around Washington, D.C., who compete for USAID and Department of State contracts to implement projects and programs in various countries, including Afghanistan. Once in Afghanistan, these companies used US government allocated funds, your taxpayer dollars, to pay international staff very large, often 6-figure salaries, rent office space and housing at exorbitant prices, pay private security firms and logistics companies to for protection and assistance, also at exorbitant prices. And then after all those funds are spent, the implementing partners use the leftover funds to hire local Afghan-run NGOs. And for many women's programs, these were women-led Afghan NGOs or civil society organizations. And then those organizations are tasked with the difficult and very dangerous work of fulfilling the project or program mandate, which has generally been conceptualized by individuals in Washington, D.C., or living outside of Afghanistan with little or no cultural knowledge or understanding of the complexities of daily life in Afghanistan. For example, USAID didn't really start to even provide pre-deployment training for their employees who were going to Afghanistan until 2011. And that training was at that time 9 days long. And over the next decade, it was shortened to 7 and then to a few days. And then really pretty much at the end, it was basically an hour of training. which, I mean, I've been studying Afghanistan for 20 years, and I feel like I still only have scratched the surface of the complexities of this incredibly complicated country, as all countries are. So the Afghan-run NGOs operate on much less funding than their international counterparts, which led to extensive and rampant turnover both within international and Afghan organizations. So that was another issue that we identified, is there was just extensive amount of turnover. And this is what I term international brain drain. Internal brain drain. So many Afghan-run organizations experience a form of what I'm calling internal brain drain, meaning that due to massive pay disparities between what international organizations could offer to local Afghan women and men and what local and Afghan-run NGOs could offer, many Afghan organizations had difficulty maintaining staff and institutional knowledge within their own organizations. The majority of the organizational leaders, my research team and I interviewed, complained about investing time, energy, and training into young Afghan women to work within their organizations, only to have them leave once they had enough skills to get a job with an international organization. And while everyone we interviewed did not blame the women for doing this, because they understood that they had to provide for their families and wanted to increase their salaries, this situation calls attention to the income disparities between these organizations, and which made the process of creating sustainable and long-lasting programs difficult for many organizations because they just didn't have the staff to do it. And then this leads to the other issue, which I think is one of the largest issues, which is the lack of listening. So many programs funded by USAID and other international organizations and their implementing partners were, as mentioned, conceptualized by internationals rather than their Afghan partners. The donor-driven approach, which I would argue has been critiqued thoroughly by development scholars for probably over 30, maybe even 40 years now, as a flawed system due to the lack of community support and therefore inability of projects to continue over the long term. So this is thoroughly critiqued, but still very rampant. For example, when interviewing international workers, and this was workers both at USAID and the United Nations, I asked them several times why they were not designing programs based on Afghan women's ideas or needs. And this was after interviewing Afghan women who were basically saying, we feel like we're not being listened to, they're implementing projects that aren't going to work. And the regular response I received was, quote, because I don't think they have good ideas, end quote. And so this was a generally white privileged international person saying that without any sort of background knowledge or information about Afghanistan. While these international workers may have not agreed with Afghan women, their criticism was from the perspective of their own social, economic, and political context. Additionally, their experiences was from their geographic location of their own home country, not Afghanistan. They did not consider the complexities, complications, and even at times contradictions that Afghan women endure within their diverse social, cultural, economic, and political context within the country. And so this leads me to the next point, which is the diversity of women's experiences, ideologies, and methodologies for improvement. And as I mentioned before, women they're not a single category. Similar to men, they come from different ethnic groups, they come from they speak different languages, different education levels. It's incredibly diverse country. And so expecting women to all have the same experience and all think with the same idea and voice, I think is already basically a flawed way of approaching it. So Afghanistan, as I just mentioned, it's multilingual and multi-ethnic country. It's predominantly Muslim, but with different belief systems, different sects, teachings, and interpretations of Islam. It is also stratified based on socioeconomic class, education levels, along with cultural diversity and differential access to resources based on a number of factors. Therefore, a one-size-fits-all approach to assistance programs or advocate for women's rights was a flawed endeavor from the start. So there's no way you could have, I would argue, you could have one way of assisting Afghan women, because also partially based on location, where you are in the country, your access to education, how conservative your family is, whether articulating women's rights within Islam may be a better approach versus articulating in a sort of Western liberal feminist approach, or maybe your family are more leftist, and that makes more sense to advocate in that way. So a one size fits all was never going to work. And then Afghan women, they're not a singularly minded group. They have different ideologies and beliefs. And I argue that this diversity should be celebrated, not countered. And it should be attended to with all of its complexities, rather than attempting to push projects and programs that reflected the values of and beliefs of US-based and other and their allies. So the beliefs of US organizations and their allies wasn't necessarily going to work in the country as well. So in addition to these issues, many international workers had limited access to Afghan communities due to strict security protocols, which prevented them from engaging with Afghans in their homes and with their families and communities. And this, I think, was a real missing out of the international organizations, because being on the receiving end of a lot of Afghan hospitality over 20 years, it's so important it's such an important part of the culture and how Afghans, communicate and connect with guests and with people visiting their country. And to not be able to do that, I think was, hard for a lot of Afghans we interviewed, but also I feel really just created a barrier between international organizations and Afghans, where they were always seen as potentially dangerous rather than allies in reconstruction efforts. So for many women-led and women's rights organizations that we interviewed, security was regularly identified, along with a lack of funding, as the main barrier to starting a project or disrupting the flow or continuation of existing programs in various communities. And the interesting thing within those communities, as what many women's organizations also stated, is that while communities really believed it was their job to provide security for Afghan women-led NGOs or civil society organizations doing projects, so that didn't necessarily disrupt their legitimacy to work in a particular community, but lack of funding was seen as basically challenging their legitimacy or making them seem like they weren't a strong or viable organization. So in addition to that, security concerns in Afghanistan over the past 20 years were regularly mitigated by the US and the International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF. ISAF, however, officially closed operations in Afghanistan in 2014, and then security operations were transferred to Afghan forces, along with US Special Forces and additional military support until the withdrawal in August of 2021. So Afghan forces were also stymied by corruption and mismanagement, including not paying soldiers or providing effective ground support. And this, I would argue, was also buttressed partially by the Trump administration's legitimization of the Taliban and the so-called peace talks in Doha, Qatar. And after we actually interviewed several women who were participated in the peace talks in 2019, which was the last time I was in Afghanistan, and they discussed their distrust of the Taliban and the lack of effective listening or engagement with women leaders. Additionally, while the peace talks were occurring in Qatar, many places in Afghanistan were besieged by Taliban violence, such as suicide bombings and extrajudicial murders. So interestingly, despite these flaws and failures, I would place most of them on at the feet of the US. Many Afghan women, especially in the capital city, Kabul, and other major urban areas, were able to gain access to education, economic opportunities, and public and political participation. In some ways, this participation was contingent on, and in some cases dependent on, international assistance, but not in all cases. Afghan women are incredibly resourceful, strong, and found amazing ways to basically advocate for their own rights and their own position in ways that worked within their own culture that I would argue were in many ways invisible to international development and aid organization, and frankly invisible to me until I learned and spent a lot of time researching this and speaking to Afghan women leaders. And certainly there were entrenched problems and extensive issues of various branches of government throughout the country, such as issues of corruption and cronyism. But why don't we talk about international corruption? Why don't we talk about the corruption and the waste of funding, and how small the percentage of dollars that were actually spent were sent to Afghanistan were actually spent there, and how many of those US dollars actually came back to the US through various contracts, and the amount of wealth generation that was created by many, many international workers and independent companies that were operating there. So I would argue that it is absolutely necessary to critique the US's role in the ongoing and unrelenting conflict and uncertainty in Afghanistan. Without a robust and continued reflection on the failures and successes of US-led interventions in Afghanistan, we are doomed to repeat the same mistakes. I say this with confidence because we've made these mistakes before. If we look at US intervention in other countries, and if you look at the vast development literature and critiques of the US, we can see that this isn't the first time that the US has done this kind of intervention, which, you know, had this waste of money and incongruent connections with local organizations and not listening to people on the ground. This is an endemic problem of, I would say, US and other forms of international aid. I also want to remind, as I started the talk with, the US did not begin intervening in Afghanistan in 2001. The US, we could go back to post-World War II in the 1950s, when the US and the Soviet Union, as part of the Cold War, were competing for influence in Afghanistan through various large-scale international development programs, from road building to massive dam construction. And then in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was occupying Afghanistan, the US helped to fund disparate mujahideen groups that were for the most part radical religious groups that were organized to fight against the Soviet Union. And in fact, the Department of State and the Reagan administration wanted to create a pan-Islamic jihad to fight godless communism. That was considered a geostrategic position at the time. So the US, so much of the current discourse is on the last 20 years, but I would argue you have to go back further to see how long the US has been meddling in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden also was one of the many foreign fighters allied with the US at that time, and later one of the many who turned against the US. In the 1980s, it was the Soviets that were, quote unquote, saving Afghan women. Fighting wars and providing assistance under the banner of the, quote unquote, saving women trope is a false and flawed narrative that is used to garner political support and far too quickly and easily abandoned for geopolitical expediency. Afghanistan is both a tragedy and a lesson for us all, because the US continues to make the same policy and political errors while expecting a positive result that never truly materializes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Fleury, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. And I know there would be some questions about your critical points that you raised about US involvement pre and post 9/11, because you touched on a number of points that were post pre 9/11 in the 80s and the 90s. There will be some questions, and I was writing down some of the points that you said, the 5 factors, and I will have a comment and question after Wazhma speaks. So we already have a question, so we'll go back later to the questions, but Wazhma Frogh, please go ahead and present your remarks on the topic, and we'll go back to the questions after that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's good to see you, Ahmadzai, after so many years. I still believe we are young, despite the fact that the program that we had started in 2003 or 4, it was the Young Leaders Forum. A lot of us Afghans who had returned from, refugee life from different parts of the world, and especially from Pakistan, we all had come together and remind me, it was not a project, right? It was not an international community or an international organization. It was our own initiative, and literally all of that group ended up in senior level positions in the government and became leaders. And today many of them are leaders. And so thank you so much for inviting me to this interesting conversation. And understanding the dangers of the single story, I would also talk about the other side of the story, which is the Afghanistan and the Afghan women themselves, beyond the lens of the war, beyond the lens of the US, because we see ourselves much more beyond, much more, complicated, much more diverse, as Jennifer talked about, than the way US or any other country in the world would look at us. And so I very much think, like my journey of a time, like we became refugees, my family became a refugee in the late 80s. We went to Pakistan, and of course, being in a different country, like finding opportunities for education. My parents educated me. There was a lot of importance of education in my family. Like my dad, my mom, they did so much to ensure that the kids are educated, they go to school, despite the fact that we were in a different country. And I was working with so many Afghans in the refugee camps when the 9/11 happened, and we actually had no idea. Many of us thought this was a Bollywood movie that was playing out in CNN and other places, because we could not even visualize, or we could not even put things together how something like that could happen. And then after that, like I came to Afghanistan in December 2001. With a lot of dreams, and many women of my generation, we all came back to Afghanistan, and literally at a time where everything was ruined. Of course, there was the US, bombing of the Taliban regime had just happened. The people were very much, relieved to get rid of the Taliban oppressive regime that was in power at that time. But at the same time, there was people were like really tired of what they had suffered in all those 6-7 years of the Taliban, but also a civil war of the Mujahideen, which was the warlords fighting each other and ruining Kabul. So we had, like, what I remember these past 20 years of my life, like especially after 2002, these were like many golden years of my life, because what we started putting as, when you build a house, you put brick over brick. And now in my country, we use bricks. So, when you put brick over brick and make a house, that's how we felt. And that's how we started building a house for ourselves, and literally building our homes, after 2002. And what I would like to focus is very much, that the spaces that we as women, and there is no, and I have to say, we were the women who were in Kabul and in big cities. Of course, we were not in villages. We were in the city, in the capital. We had more access to, to the government, to the international community. And in Afghanistan, which was getting attention from the world, which was not, which was very much new for us. And a lot of money came, a lot of money, was misused as well. But a lot of spaces were created. And I'll share some of that here. I hope I can do that with my screen. Okay. I'm trying to share these are some of the pictures, from those times that I'd like to share. And yes, here. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it, Wazhma. Go ahead.
Okay. So literally some of the timelines, what we did, and these are the processes where I, as an individual and as a woman, myself participated. So, for example, if I'm talking about the 2004 Constitution, and me and my colleagues, we were like traveling to so many parts of the country, and we sat under trees in Bamiyan, we sat under trees in Badakhshan, we sat under trees in Ghazni and Kandahar, and we brought people together, kind of, okay, there is a constitution coming up, like what are you looking for? And the struggles we had inside that tent, which is a very famous tent where 4,000, 5,000 influential political groups and tribal leaders, religious leaders, mostly men, gather, and then women are in small numbers. But then we had actually started strategizing. So we, when some of us had identified one leader to work with, that, oh, we want these articles in the Constitution. Some of us worked with, that time Khalilzad was the US ambassador, and he had, of course, a very important role at that time, and many other religious leaders, or the Mujahideen leaders, for example. So those were like that tent, and it just, when I talk about it, kind of those memories come to me very much alive. And yes, there was a quota, for women in the parliament, but at the same time, the role that women played in the politics. For example, the first election we had in 2004-5, around 40% women were voters. So which was very, very much like, huge for us. And having women in the parliament. So last night I was talking to a member of parliament from one of the central highlands of Afghanistan, and she shared, her life story as a woman. She was in school in grade 6 when 2001 happened, and how she, from grade 6, how she became, in high school, and then became engaged in community programs, started learning about parliament, and became a parliamentarian in 2015, for example. So struggles of women like that, is kind of makes you wonder, about change, that change in communities and change in societies, that's very much possible when people start, taking up the spaces. And, like we do, the number of girls, the millions of women that started going to schools, despite the fact that we had, a lot of security challenges, not just from the Taliban, but also from a lot of military and, armed groups in different parts of the country. For example, this picture, on the right, you see women who went and started, taking cards for registration cards, and many of them were saying, this is the first time somebody is asking our names. This is the first time, somebody says, like, what's your name and what's your ID number, for example. So those era was very much, the spaces that were created were like historical for these young women, for children, for example. Like you see the girls running for a marathon in Bamiyan, in our, in the, of course, in some parts of the country, things were much easier because of the insurgency of the Taliban. Like we didn't have a lot of insurgency in the early years in the north, also in the central highlands, but it was more in the southeastern regions of the country. And then after 2007 and 2008, then the situation started getting more volatile in all over the country. And some of the formal official numbers that's important that I would like to share, that within civil service. So we have around 2.5 million people within the civil service, or at least until August 15. And right now, too many of the government agencies continue working. Yes, they are not being paid, many of them, but 30% of the civil service were actually women. And this started from ministers, women as directors, women as ambassadors, women in the a lot of other important positions. And around 5 million girls actually happen to be in schools, mostly in the primary levels. And of course, the education is a very problematic topic. It's not as straightforward when you talk about it in Afghanistan. But that number was huge for us. An important reality or an achievement that we had during the years was the first elimination of violence against women law, a law that I personally worked on for 4 years, and a law that where, we literally, me and a group of like hundreds of women, for example, were engaged in it. And when we, in August 2009, we sat at President Karzai's office to make him sign it. And it had to go to the parliament, and we had a lot of, backlash from the parliamentarians. And the only solution for us was to have it as decree, a presidential decree, and we sat in his office and said, until you do not sign this law into, this decree into a law, we will not go home. And that law opened up the space for so many of crimes against women to be prosecuted. And that's something that I have witnessed personally. I've witnessed numerous cases of women where we put the perpetrators of violence, and that criminalizing, criminalizing those acts that were considered, normal, but they were violence against women. Those acts started criminalizing, and getting women in, of course, in traditional spaces was easier. And, education, health, politics, for example, other public sector, but in some very hard and non-conventional spaces where, like security, for example, which has been one of my focus areas in the past 10 years, for example, has been police and women in the army. We started family response units in the provinces. We started, for example, the last, task that I completed before, the Taliban takeover was the female police township, a township for female police, where we provided, training centers, daycares, that was actually built, for female police. And in the level of women in the media, for example, the news, industry, in the media, we had at least 1,200 women until August 15 in the media, which was in 2001, we started with the RTA, the Radio Television of Afghanistan, which is the national state-owned. And in August, we had 74 television channels, for example, and over hundreds of radio, FMs, for example, and many of these young women, found spaces in media, because especially in the radio and in the print media, because their identities could actually be, saved and hidden as well. Like, so many girls were so happy to come into the radio shows, for example, and tell their stories and the realities of their lives, so the public spaces and taking up those spaces were very much important for us. We, in girls in small numbers, got into, for example, sports, being able to go out in masses and really standing up for themselves. And I want to share a story of a woman that, that we worked with, and that changed the law. And that's Lal Bibi's story. BBC has done a documentary on her as well. She was a gang rape survivor. So there was an afternoon in June 2012, around maybe 60-70 elders, old men with long beards and turbans, entered our office. And we were so worried that we thought maybe they are trying to, do something, that this is a woman organization, or maybe something, there is an issue against us or something like that. But they said, we are here to seek justice from you. We are here to seek your help so that this child of our community can get justice. Lal Bibi was a 15-year-old girl who was abducted and gang raped by the military. It's called local police, ALP, which is a very much a creation of the US and NATO forces. They would bring a lot of these local thugs into the police and call them local police to fight the Taliban. But many of them not just fought the Taliban, but also created so much havoc and so much broke the law in the communities. And they had, to punish one community, they had, abducted and gang raped this little girl, 15-year-old Lal Bibi. We took the case as a public trial. For the first time, as you see, the judge and all the television channels in front of him, and that's her dad and mom who came up. And this is not they came from a very remote district of Kunduz, Pashtuns of Kunduz, that were actually seeking justice. And the case actually helped us. When we took the case to the court, we found out that there's no rape law in our criminal codes. The criminal codes do not recognize rape as a crime. So that helped us, this case actually helped us get, change the criminal code. And we got, rape provisions, and these guys, were, this is me. And that day was so much, for us, the first ever public trial of a rape case, and putting, powerful men in jail. So the guys that we jailed as part of this case were like big, community tribal, warlords that were each sentenced for 20 years of imprisonment. And that case opened up, the space within the judiciary. So we got women in the prosecution. We got special prosecution units called eval prosecution units. And in all of that, what I'm talking about, this, nobody told us to do this. There was no American telling us that take this case and make it a public trial. Nobody told us, no American came and told us, to do this. This was like what we had learned from other parts of the world, but also our own pursuit of justice, for example. In all these men, for example, who are sitting there from the public, these are all like public because it was a public trial. In hearing that, it was a complete game changer, for example, for the judiciary system. And this is like baby's life. Like this girl, we kind of, followed up. So she because she ended up in a shelter for some times. She learned, for example, basic skills, and she became a cook. And she was actually working in a women's restaurant before August, before what happened. So a journey of a remote girl coming from all the way from a very far province, and taking justice and getting justice and making her life. And she became, a cook in a women's restaurant that got closed in August. So what we learned in the 20 years, we stood up for ourselves, we stood up for each other, like we were on the streets, we got the spaces. Yes, we got a lot of support from the international community, and there were times that we didn't like what they did, and there were times that those of us that they thought we were very smart, they tried to kind of put us in the corner, and they thought, they would go ahead with people who would say yes to them. A lot of money came to Afghanistan as well, and it was misused. So the aid effectiveness is a complete different, chaotic issue as well. But for example, these people, this was one of our, programs for provincial counselors. So I went to different provinces where and my organization helped women, like female teachers, a nurse, a community mobilizer, just anybody, a woman, to help her to come to the provincial council where, political decisions are being made. And we provided them with skills and with opportunities so that they could actually do so. So provincial council was an important aspect of, and even today, for example, when we get a lot of, still what I believe that no matter that those institutions we have lost, but still a lot of these women who are still in Afghanistan, and they, they have found different ways of coping with the situation, home-based classes, or being, some of them, for example, on the streets, some of them, finding a different way, and female teachers not giving up. And during these years, for example, what we were also able, like within the local communities, for example, these two guys were former Taliban commanders from Nuristan and Kunar, for example, and they would come to our programs and tell us why they went to the insurgency, why they took up arms, and women would actually, put them under literally a trial, asking them why would they take up arms and fight, their own country. So, by August 15, all these women in the black and green uniforms, you see, these are judges. These are women who are formally licensed, lawyers and judges. And we had like 500 of them in August, and by August, actually. And what I want to, end here is that, yes, we spent 20 years of, struggle, and of course we had allies, but we were also like kind of given this feeling that there is a world beyond, behind us, that, you know what, we are with you and we are kind of trying to support you and we are trying to, listen to you. And then of course, the US deal with the Taliban was a very problematic one, and I can go on about that forever. But what happened in August and then afterwards, the way Afghanistan continues to be forgotten is what makes, me and so many other women, of course, very disillusioned, because it's not just about us, but it's also about the honesty of your rhetoric. So if we have a rhetoric internationally that we have, we believe in international women's rights, we believe in, international democratic rights for people, and we stand by Ukraine, where we stand by Afghans, but when it comes to real action, we abandon them like they never existed. So that's actually that hypocrisy of the international mechanisms, like if it's Security Council, if it's the UN, all those international instruments. So for me, what I'm struggling in the past 6 months, being a refugee, but at the same time, what I'm struggling with is that, so all what we told us about CEDAW, the Women, Peace and Security Frameworks, 1325, Security Council, are they just like, they are only important when you are politically relevant to them? So, and that's a major question that I think I would like to end with, is that what happens to this global solidarity with movements of people who struggle for their lives today? When girls are protesting on the streets of Kabul, for example, my organization has self-help groups for women in different provinces right now, in 20 provinces, and my colleagues have to actually let only 10 people in each session on a daily basis, and we have to say no to 20 other women. And that is the level of, continuous, interest of women in being engaged and finding out ways. For example, now I have a group of women in provinces and also some in Kabul who are working on equipping themselves with Sharia knowledge so that they can actually negotiate spaces locally as well as nationally with the Taliban leaders. That, okay, you're talking about Sharia, this is what Sharia is about, our rights. For example, that's what's happening in many parts of the country. But of course, we are not politically relevant to international media anymore, so you do not hear our stories anymore. And that's a painful reality of, how we look at different movements, social movements in the world, that we just tie them with politics, with war, and then when our purposes are kind of, when we think we have succeeded or failed, we just abandon them as they never existed. And that's a question.
Thank you very much for the wonderful remarks and the case you talked about. That personally made me emotional also, because as an Afghan American born in Afghanistan, I relate to it to a large extent. And I see myself what happened in Afghanistan and what was there achieved independently by Afghan women, regardless of the international assistance. There is no doubt that the presence of the international community did provide an environment for the Afghan women to empower themselves with the assistance. There is no doubt there is billions of dollars wasted under different names, some different projects. There are famous projects named after women that failed miserably with no achievements. Coming back to a question, I would like to start with Dr. Fleury. You in your research in Afghanistan on women, you outlined 5 factors. Please correct me if I'm wrong. I've not read your research completely and the product of that one. The administrative or the methodological factors that you outlined in your research, how have they been translated into contextual deficiencies of empowering women in Afghanistan? Those 5 factors, to me, they look more like methodological approach by the international community in assisting Afghan women to empower themselves and stand on their own feet. But there's also the contextual part with Wazhma John also mentioned what the Afghan women really need, because there is a difference between the urban needs of women and the rural needs of women. Because to rural women, it's more of access to healthcare system rather than coming on a TV show or other definitions of what they need, because there is a completely different understanding of who they are as human beings and family members. How those methodological points that you mentioned translated to contextual changes?
It's a great question. And I want to say there's more than 5. I just limited to 5 for the talk. So I could go on about other things that were, not executed well, or other factors that limited the approach. But to answer your question, I would say that, yeah, absolutely. Like the sort of differences between women in urban areas and in rural areas, that most of the international research that we did was very much limited more to urban areas. And I think part of that was for security. I mean, most of the international organizations their offices were in Kabul, and maybe they had a satellite office in Jalalabad or Herat or Mazar or Bamyan, but not always, right? And so it was very urban focused. And then I would say that it was much more up to the local organizations to reach out to the sort of rural or village scale. Then you didn't see many internationals were operating at that scale. And part of that was their security requirements. They weren't able to do it, or they would just go for like a day and back, they'd fly there and come back, and not where many Afghans, had to drive, and that took longer and was more dangerous and that sort of thing. So I think there was that. And then I would also say, I agree with you, like at the rural level, I mean, many women wanted better access to healthcare. And I would say some of the projects that did go really well that weren't really funded at all by USAID were some of the like midwifery programs to like improve, basic health and hygiene programs. And a lot of that was also spearheaded by Afghan women's organizations or local women that were connected to powerful families or men in those areas that helped to perpetuate, women's access to healthcare and break down some of the barriers to that existed during the Taliban and just out of fear and families not wanting to have their wives or daughters have access to public spaces for fear for their own security and that sort of thing. And so, and on the contextual side, I mean, like, I guess I would say that was the difference. Like you saw this money coming in and these ideas and most of the vast majority of the ideas on how to, quote unquote, help Afghan women were really based in a very, I would argue, like second wave, liberal, feminist, just get women educated and in the working sector. Although there was also efforts to have them in politics as well too. But it wasn't it was missing that contextual part, right? I would say that the Afghan women, I mean, and in some ways, the security concerns could work in an advantageous way for organizations because they could go into, they could say, oh yes, thank you, we'll take, thank you for your ideas and the funds, and they would go into a more rural area and then do a project that would work well with the community because they had to build up their own legitimacy. I mean, that was a thing that we learned a lot from interviewing women leaders in these civil society and NGOs, is they themselves had to gain their own legitimacy, going multiple times, showing that they were interested, meeting with the mullahs, meeting with the maliks and the leaders at the village level, and making sure that they were working with the community leaders and working with women who were identified as leaders, either because of their association with powerful men or because they were already midwives or they were teachers or they had gained honor and respect in the community. And so, I mean, this is something I didn't even touch on, but like the expectation of honor and honorable behavior and being a good Muslim. I mean, most women leaders fit those expectations, especially at that village level. And so as much as, outsiders critique that was necessary and part of what women had to do, and men too, right, to be considered a leader and someone people would listen to within their communities. So I would argue that there was a real mismatch between like funding ideology and the expectation on the internationals and what really was working on the ground, and many of the things that Wazhma talked about. I mean, I was like shaking my head because I'm like, yes, exactly. Like that's the difference. I mean, so many internationals weren't even aware of what Afghan women were doing, and so much of the amazing and wonderful work that they were doing.
Well, there is no doubt that we can pinpoint many misgivings and shortcomings of the international involvement and engagement in Afghanistan, specifically when it comes to women's rights and women empowerment, because of the lack of understanding and how they approach the whole topic. I was asked a question once by someone, a woman, that what I thought how we could empower women in Afghanistan. And my question was, we have a wrong approach of going directly to women. We are a patriotic society. We have to educate the men who claim to be the guardians of the women in Afghanistan. We have to remove that and educate them, and then the women are strong enough to get to the front. That is the problem. The men are the problem, not the women that we are talking about in Afghanistan. And I say this as a man of my family. I was raised by my mother, my grandmother, and I have a beautiful wife who takes care of my two kids. Coming from that context, and I could see we men have become the gatekeepers of all these things, and we never approached it that way. We blocked our sisters, our wives, our mothers from attaining the good stuff that the religion offers them. Actually, we define their rights. That needs to be structural change in the mindset of the Afghan men. Coming back to Wazhma, you work with men in Afghanistan and try to educate them. And in the last 20 years, there were strides made and there were changes made in the mentality of the Afghan men. The picture you showed of those two Taliban commanders, they were there talking about women's rights with you rather than anything else. Those 50 men who came to your office, they sought your assistance in seeking justice for their daughter. Those were the men. Their mothers didn't come. The men came actually to you. You achieved these things in 20 years. Yes, Taliban now claim to have been 2.0 with a little bit difference. With a very vague definition of the Sharia laws, Sharia practice for women's rights, but nothing concrete in the document say these are the rights that you have to practice, but more of a vague definition. Those achievements, do you think have reversed or gone, or the new Afghanistan is still struggling or trying to find its way within this context of Taliban ruling Afghanistan? What do you think?
You know, a lot of women are saying in Afghanistan, like in Kabul and other parts, that Taliban came with an attitude that we should get used to them, but now they are facing a situation that they need to get used to us.
Absolutely.
And that's a reality on many parts. Yes, the education among girls, for example, the taste of freedom, for example, you know, these young women who protested on the street, but also many other young women who had cafes, who read a book in a cafe, who went to a gym, who learned, yoga in a gym, or who had, for example, a restaurant in Kabul or in Herat or in Bamiyan, for example. These women, yes, the spaces are taken from them, but that, self-awareness is still there, right?
Yes.
That nobody can take that away from them, that what they have learned all these 20 years. So we have lost the spaces, but what we haven't lost is these, awarenesses and that consciousness. And that's what makes me very much, hopeful that the Taliban, even if the oppressive regime oppressing them or trying to fight, them, and see them as co-conspirators of the West. For example, that is, the major challenge. The Taliban see us as the co-conspirators of the previous government and the West. But now that they are getting, home to home and seeing and finding books, for example, one of their foot soldiers was saying on the social media that, the number of books that we found in these homes was amazing. We never knew that people are reading books in this country. like their lack of understanding about Afghanistan, and this Afghanistan that has come that long, 20 years. So I have, and as I said, we work with different groups of women in parts of the country who are still in Afghanistan, who have not been, who have not left their homes. Yes, maybe they have left their province for their safety, but they have not left the country. They are not sitting idle because they are worried about their daughter to go to school. They are worried about their son to go to school and find a job, for example. They are worried about themselves. And so many of these girls who were educated. So remember the number of girls every year, at least 40,000 girls came from the provinces to Kabul University for concours exam, and they were, and they got into the exam. So imagine that kind of awareness and educated number of women, all of them, they are not all evacuated. They are all inside Afghanistan in strategizing different ways. Somebody, wearing a burqa and getting out. Somebody, covering herself completely with something so that she cannot be, identified. And still they are figuring out. And I believe that the Taliban of course are having a hard time oppressing this society, but at the same time they cannot continue doing it. So when you see, for example, a young girl, a blogger from Kabul, for example, talking to a foot soldier of the Taliban, and he smiling to her that when she asked him a personal question, and a lot of people were angry about my tweet that I said the humanity beyond is, the humanity in this young boy who has an arm, who has lived his life in the mountains or in a madrasa. But when a young woman asks her about his wife and he smiles, they connect on a human to human level. And that's what's important to me. And I believe that, this would, open up the spaces for people to connect with a lot of the, foot soldiers of the Taliban on the ground, because how many are they? I do not believe that, having worked in Afghanistan within the Afghan government and beyond, I know that there are not even more than 100,000 Taliban members armed, across the country. So if, for example, we are able to kind of negotiate some of these spaces locally with them, things will start changing. That's my hope.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You both already have fans actually in the audience, and there is one of them trying to reach both of you, and Jennifer responded, and Wazhma, she wants to interview you at a time. If you can write down your email to her, that would be wonderful. She could interview. She's a colleague here at UNO, a research scholar, visiting research scholar. I'm going to go with the questions from the audience here. We have a number of questions. Either of you would like to jump in and answer. I'm going to read it out. One of the participants, Alex Becker, says, what are some of the socioeconomic identities and religious affiliations or lack of for Afghan women in our society in Afghanistan? Any one of you would like to answer that question? Jennifer would like to jump in that?
Sure. So sorry, I'm just trying to read it too. So the socioeconomic identity. So I mean, like any society, there are definitely different class levels in Afghanistan. I mean, not everyone has the same, makes the same amount of money or has the same amount of influence, or his family is considered as respected or well-known in a community. So that would be one. And then religious affiliations, like I said, the vast majority of the country is Muslim, but that doesn't mean that everyone thinks exactly the same way. I mean, there are Shia and Sunni differences, but even within those, you have Afghan women and men, advocating for women's rights within Islam in a very different way than you would say, like the Taliban would imagine women's roles are in society. So thinking about how the Quran is read, how it's interpreted. I mean, many of the Afghan women who were articulating women's rights within Islam were working with very progressive mullahs and male mullahs, or exclusively male, in the community or throughout the country that could help at a more sort of place-based district or village scale to help to articulate women's rights. And this is everything from in women should be educated. Women and men are considered to be equal before the eyes of God in the Quran. Women can inherit property, which is not a common practice in Afghanistan, but is allowed in the Quran. Some customary practices in Afghanistan that disadvantage women, such as like exchanging women to settle debts between men, that's haram or forbidden in Islam. So there are many ways in which Islam, I think, is seen as a really progressive force towards women. And this is where I totally agree with you on the men's education part too. And in fact, several men that we interviewed were like, we don't need a women's ministry, we need a men's ministry, because we need to educate men about women's rights, you know. And some of the women's rights activists said that they, when they have trainings, the first thing they do is talk about what men's rights are in Islam, in the Constitution, in the new Afghanistan, so that women go home and tell men, like, we know what your rights are, and then they'll more likely to let their women go to these trainings, you know. So I do think it's like you have to be really strategic about it as well.
We have, unfortunately, few minutes before Wazhma Jan leaves us. We have 10 minutes overall, but let's say we have 7 minutes, and then I'll let Ramazan to conclude our today's session. I'm going to go with one of the questions. How can we condemn the human rights abuse taking place in Afghanistan or elsewhere, I would say, especially in the Muslim societies, while not perpetuating harmful stereotypes about Muslims or Afghan citizens itself? Because some of the time when we try to condemn human rights or women's rights in certain societies, we seem to look like we are stereotyping certain things and norms in different societies. What would be your take? I have my own thought on that. Wazhma?
Well, you know, that's a hard question, and no matter how much we try not to, it happens. Because, you know, when I, for example, try to condemn what happens in Kabul, for example, when girls are detained, or when there is, you know, when girls are not being allowed to go to school, for example, then I see, you know, a bunch of trolls saying, oh, you Muslims are like this anyways. But so, and then, to be honest, I don't have the patience to go through that. I just block that person. But what I actually have learned in 20 years is that, you know, that Muslim identity is so diverse. You know, yes. The person who says I'm a Muslim, you know, in one community, than the other community, not even within the sects, even within the Sunni or the Hanafi, or even within the Jafari, the Shias, for example. And there is something, you know, and that's the complexity. And I understand that when you try to explain to people the complexity and people get a bit uncomfortable about that, they try not to get that complexity. They want simple things, you know, because the world is so much used to just, you know, these black and whites. Either you're this or you're that. You're a Muslim, so you're bad. You're a Muslim, so you're against women's rights. And that kind of, it has been there, you know, it's very hard to fight with it. But at the same time, you know, if that hypocrisy, what I think has been, we have felt is the hypocrisy of the Muslim Ummah, particularly, or the Muslim countries. We haven't had the Muslim countries, you know, standing up for the atrocities that are taking place in Afghanistan. It doesn't matter that it's being committed by you know, a foreigner or by an Afghan, but it's happening on you know, in a Muslim society, but also on a human being. So from a human rights perspective, you know, that humanity aspect of it is important. We have seen the hypocrisy of our neighbors, you know, from Pakistan to Iran. I was looking for solidarity from Pakistan. We never got, you know, a word of solidarity from the women leaders in Pakistan, from the civil society in Pakistan. In Iran is similar, for example, or Central Asian countries, or even OIC, you know, for example. So and that is actually, you know, an area that I think we need to do better. And that's where we need solidarity. It's not just about that stereotyping, but when you stand for, you know, a human being and saying this is what's happening to these girls in Afghanistan is wrong. And this goes against all our, you know, all religious and international human rights norms. I think it's important to not be a hypocrite. So it's, I think, a decision of choosing whether we want to continue being a hypocrite or somebody that can actually stand for humanity.
We have 6 minutes. We have 6 minutes. Okay. We have 6 minutes. I will ask Jennifer to comment, and then Ramadan, you're leading our Center for Islamic Studies. I will then ask you to, if you want to answer this question from your perspective, and then end of the session, that would be great. So for me, Jennifer, and then Ramadan, please go ahead. Jennifer, you want to take this question on?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, absolutely. I agree, this is a really difficult, but I think with all the sort of, discussions about race and racism in the US, that this is a really good time to make sure that, you can condemn what the Taliban is doing without condemning all Muslims, right? So you can say, like, I condemn what's happening on a humanitarian level, but the Taliban does not represent all Muslims. The Taliban doesn't represent most Muslims in Afghanistan, so those kinds of ways of condemning it by adding that understanding of, like, this is not all of Islam. This is a very small fraction, and just as, we can condemn certain things in our own countries, but we're not condemning all of what, one particular group. And I think anytime a group has been marginalized, we really have to be careful on how we, condemn the actions of a particular group without all the associations that seem to be connected to that group. And I would also say, like, there was a tremendous amount of abuse committed by the International Aid and Development Mission. I mean, there were active brothels, women were trafficked in to serve as sex workers for, international, not Afghan men. I mean, this is international men working as logistics and in the private contractor business, and even some in the international aid and development. Every international non-Afghan woman that we interviewed had experienced sexual harassment and abuse in Afghanistan by other international men, not by Afghan men. So, and I always say that to sort of push back against this assumption that everything bad in Afghanistan is connected to Afghans or to the religion of Islam, which is, I think, completely ridiculous. But that's such part of the overwhelming discourse that I think anything we can do to counter that is really important. Because I would argue that, some of the most wonderful and amazing people I know are Afghans and have done tremendous things to help their fellow, whether it's women, children, men, that there's, some of the most progressive feminists I know are Afghan men, actually. So, I think there's, in some ways, Afghan men are more progressive about women's rights than some American men, frankly, in my experience. So those kind of ways, I think, are real. And I think it's important for someone that looks like me to say that too, where Wazhma, for example, has such a hard time. And I do follow her on Twitter, and I see how she's trolled, and it's totally horrible because people just make so many assumptions just by how we look.
That's right.
Okay, thank you so much. I think on this question, maybe I can say a few words, not getting into much details, but I think what both Wazhma and Jennifer said are important. Acknowledging the diversity of Muslims is significant, but from another level, I think it's also important that we have people like Wazhma who are Muslim, but at the same time critical of some of the things. As those people are becoming more visible, I think people will also see that diversity in action. And also sometimes when Muslims are discussing their own countries, it's for understandable reasons. We know how widespread Islamophobia is in the United States and in Europe particularly. So within that context, it is sometimes difficult to be self-critical, but I think it's really very constructive that Muslims also are coming out and engaging taking a more critical stance with what's happening in their places is, I think, also important in addressing this question. So it will make a little bit more comfort, I think, to the people as well. I mean, that's also an important part of this, and I see lots of that happening actually these days, which I think is a great thing. We have lots of questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So I would like to thank everyone for joining in this busy time. I don't think of a time that's not busy on campus, but I'm especially thankful for our students who were here and asked lots of questions, and more importantly, our speakers. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for providing us a great perspective on women's movement and the issues that we usually don't think when we talk about women in the region. And Wazhma had to leave earlier, but we are very thankful for the perspective that she put here. And thank you so much, Sherjan, for your excellent moderation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.